Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. This is David Nevins for City BizList. And today we continue with another in our series sponsored by the Bridge Alliance, which we call Repairing America's Broken Democracy. I think most of us would agree we have a fair amount of work to do in that regard. Today we have a very special guest, and he is Bradley Tusk. Bradley is a venture capitalist, political strategist, philanthropist, writer, numerous other things. But Bradley, I'll let you talk about yourself in that regard. Welcome to our program.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
It's indeed our pleasure. So, Bradley, I know you are you started something called the Mobile Voting Project, and I think that's one of your significant initiatives, aside, let's say, from your venture capitalist day job, right? So tell us how you got into this and you know where you are and where it's headed.
The first part of my career was actually spent working in government and politics. I was Mike Bloomberg's campaign manager when he ran for mayor of New York. I was the deputy governor of Illinois for 4 years. I was Chuck Schumer's communications director in the U.S. Senate. And so I worked in city government, state government, federal government, executive branch, legislative branch, ran campaigns. I feel like I've seen this thing from every conceivable angle, right? And the biggest takeaway I had from all of it is every policy output is determined by a political input. Every elected official cares more about re-election than any specific policy because it fills a void in their psyche, and they have to have that validation, they have to have that affirmation. So expecting them to act against their political interests is completely unreasonable. So if you want different outputs, you have to change the inputs. Then 2011 through 13, 14, I ran a bunch of campaigns to legalize Uber and ride sharing all over the US. And the way that we won, keep in mind now Uber's a $70 billion company, but at the time we were a tiny little tech startup and the taxi industry was pretty muscular, is that we were able to get our customers to mobilize from the app. And ultimately a couple of million people told their mayor, city councilman, state senator, whoever the relevant person was for that situation, don't take this thing away from me. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, the people who are doing this, I'm sure are not regular primary voters, right? They might vote for the president or something like that, but these people aren't showing up for city council primaries. But it's not that they're too apathetic to do anything. They're too apathetic on a random Tuesday to just go someplace, miss work, miss school, whatever it is, wait in line and deal with it, right? But look what happens when you make it easier, they participate. And then a couple of years later, as sort of blockchain technology kept improving, it went from wouldn't it be cool if you could vote this way to maybe you could vote this way. And so in March of 2018, we kicked it off with a pilot program with the state of West Virginia, where deployed military from 2 counties were able to vote on their phone over the blockchain in actual elections. That went well, turnout increased, it was audited and came back clean. Did it again in the general with deployed military from 24 counties. Since then have done elections in 21 different jurisdictions across 7 different states. And interestingly, some are very blue, like Oregon and Washington State and Delaware, and some are very red, like Utah and West Virginia and South Carolina, and one purple in Colorado. And so we have funded these elections. We've paid for all of the costs for government. So there's been no out of pocket. And the good news is, on average, turnout doubled. Every single one of those was audited by the National Cybersecurity Center and came back clean. So it worked. And we expanded it so it was both deployed military and people with disabilities. However, the cybersecurity community still remained convinced that despite the fact that we had 21 in a row that were successful, there was still a significant risk. So I made the decision that we would build our own mobile voting technology, and I'm funding this out of my pocket, working with members of the cybersecurity community so that A, we produce the safest possible app, and B, hopefully we can take some of the naysayers and bring them onto our side. And so the next step is building this technology. We're about halfway through the process right now, and then making it open source and free to anyone who wants it. And then the really hard part is going to be, we've got to pass a law probably in every single state that allows mobile voting for all voters. And if you want to unite Democratic and Republican politicians, do something that could change their hold on power, right? So they're not, incumbents in both parties aren't going to like it. Unions aren't going to like it. Lobbyists aren't going to like it. Trade groups aren't going to like it. Anyone who benefits from the current system of low turnout primaries is not going to like it. But we've got to overcome that. And so my hope is that we get Gen Z to basically refuse to accept otherwise. Like I have one guy whose whole job is just all day, he's on TikTok talking about mobile voting. Hopefully we can spark a movement and younger people just won't accept it. And by the time that we've got this technology up and running, we can pass these bills and maybe by, 2030, everyone's voting on their phone.
Like a bit of a no-brainer. Tell me what I'm missing here. Besides, I think a few moments ago you stated the obvious. That is that the incumbents benefit from essentially the status quo in terms of how people vote and what have you. But to all those who challenge the safety and integrity of elections, with regard to mobile voting and so forth, those same people, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, they're sending their money through Zelle, they're paying by PayPal, they're paying with their phones by credit card. The worst case scenario in an election is, a handful of people end up voting. Maybe someone grabs your phone or something like that, as opposed to hundreds of millions of dollars, every minute at stake. Yeah. So what am I missing here?
We now do a lot of our healthcare on the phone. And maybe most importantly, we send our darkest and deepest secrets and thoughts and hopes to each other over text and email, right? So like most people would far rather who they voted for come out than, their deep secrets. So look, part of it is, I think that people who are opposed to it are saying this has to be perfect in order to allow it. And they're forgetting that every existing form of voting has significant problems, right? So voting machines are constantly breaking down, right? So the integrity of them. We saw what kind of mail-in ballots did in the 2020 elections in terms of uncertainty and everything else. And I'm for mail-in ballots, but they're not a panacea. And even paper ballots, that's what got us Bush v. Gore in the Iraq War. So that's certainly not a great legacy. And so I think you've got to view mobile voting in the light of all different types of voting technology and forms to say, how risky are they and what's the upside? The upside for the systems I just mentioned is very limited because they all continue the status quo. And the status quo is a significant problem. We live in a world right now where because of gerrymandering, every district is really determined in advance but what party it's going to go to. That means only the primary really matters in the vast majority of elections. And primary turnout in this country is 10 to 20%, right? So if you have figured out how to game that system really well, I can understand why you wouldn't want to put it at risk. And I think on both sides of the aisle, they have different types of concerns, but still concerns. So on the Republican side of the aisle, we've seen the legislation. And just to be clear, I'm an independent. If you think I hate your favorite party, I do. But the Republicans, we saw legislation in Florida, Georgia, Texas, designed to reduce turnout. So they clearly feel like they do better in lower turnout elections. And on the Democratic side, so I'll just use Chuck Schumer as an example because I used to work for him. If you told Chuck we're going to have mobile voting, and therefore, Chuck, a lot of things that you believe in are more likely to happen as a result, he would say, absolutely not. And you would say, why? If you were being honest, he would say, because I'm terrified of a primary by AOC, and she would know how to use the technology much better than I could, and it could threaten my next election. And all I ultimately care about is keeping my job as senator. So I think on both sides, it makes them nervous. However, there are a lot of members of state legislatures and city councils and Congress who are a little younger, typically in the 40 to 45 range, that do understand this and I think are coming around to support it. But basically, it's a combination of politicians wanting to protect the power that they have, special interests wanting to protect their influence, and some cybersecurity experts sort of not really understanding the actual trade-offs here.
I understand that you are making a lot of progress, though, perhaps slow and steady. And you mentioned before we went live with this, you mentioned a couple of areas that were potentially on the verge of using full mobile technology in their elections. Share that with.
So District of Columbia, the city, not Washington, D.C. as a congressional, there's legislation that was introduced in February by Councilmember Pinto that would allow everyone in the district to vote in elections on their phones. There are 13 members of the D.C. City Council. You need 7 votes to pass a bill. We have 8 co-sponsors at the moment. We're trying to add more. And so I think we've got, at least a decent shot of passing this thing. And that will do a few things for us. One, it'll create some precedent, right? So typically speaking, most in government, they're a little too nervous to be the first to do things because then they worry that if they go bad, they'll get blamed for it. But once there's proof of concept, it becomes easier to accomplish. So that's number one. Number two is it'll give us a lot of data on both how campaigns to allow mobile voting work and then how mobile voting itself works, right? Who participates, how much more, how much people choose to use this as opposed to the other systems. But we're not proposing to get rid of the other stuff. We just want to layer in mobile voting as another option. And also who really does and does not have smartphones. So the data varies a little bit. The low end numbers I've seen are like 75% of American adults have a smartphone. The highest I've seen is about 90%. Let's just call it somewhere in the middle. For the 80-something percent of people that have a smartphone, are more of them choosing to vote because now it's really easy. That's my hope. And that's where I think we're trying to get to.
Yeah, and I guess not to mention the fact that when you go back to, or we remain with the traditional form of voting, certainly more people have the ability to vote by cell phone than have the ability to take several hours off of work for a day, than have the ability to drive to a polling place, and so on and so forth. This just seems as if voting in America has not caught up with the current technology, though clearly the reasons that you give, I share your, I'll call it healthy cynicism with regard to government and politics. And, my own view is, and I'll add mobile voting to the list, I assure you, but my own view is that both gerrymandering and the lack of term limits is what contributes to the current status.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look, there are a lot of things that contribute to the status quo, and there are a lot of different ideas on how to fix it. I would argue that the two transformational fixes would be gerrymandering reform and mobile voting, right? So either if you could create districts that were truly competitive, that would force politicians to the middle, right? And that would mean more mainstream consensus. And by the way, an incentive politically to actually have compromise and get things done. Right now, because the people who vote in primaries tend to be the most ideological on the left or the right, they just want purity. They don't want actual progress in legislation and everything else. So if you're appealing to them for votes, you play along, which means you're not looking for compromise either, which is why we see, so little actually get done. I think that it moves things to the middle. And so judicial reform would certainly do that. However, the Supreme Court about 2 years ago said, we're not touching this thing at all. Maybe that could change, but with the current makeup of the court, it doesn't seem like it will change, which means true redistricting reform that could produce more competitive elections seems unlikely. And to me, the other thing that could meaningfully change the equation is mobile voting, right? Because if we can get turnout, let's take an example. I'll give you one from both parties to make it fair. You're a Republican congressman from Florida. Turnout in your primary is 12%. Your district is gerrymandered. It's the only election that matters is the primary. NRA members are half of that 12%. There's no way that intellectually you don't think it's crazy that you and I can walk into a store and walk out with a machine gun, right? There's no world in which that's sort of logical to anybody. However, you also know that if you vote for an assault weapon ban, those NRA members are going to throw you out in the next primary and you're going to lose your job. And keeping that job and that source of validation is much more important to you than gun violence. But imagine if people could vote on their phones and turnout goes to 45%. So I'm not even trying to come up with 80 or some big number. Just based on the polling on assault weapons and how people line up, you would have to be for it simply because that's what the majority wants, right? And so the policy output shifts because the political input shifted, right? The people who were weighing in became more moderate, and as a result, the output became more moderate. Or, I'm here in New York City. A couple of years ago, Amazon wanted to build their second headquarters in a neighborhood in Queens, and I think everyone thought, no brainer, we want the jobs. Then now disgraced Governor Cuomo was really celebrating it, and they lost. They actually had to leave. They didn't get and the reason why is same thing. Even though the majority of people in that district of Long Island City wanted it, and a majority of New York City residents wanted it, turnout in like that state Senate primary or the city council primary is like 8%, 12%, 9%. That small group of people, we're talking only about thousands of people, it's a really small number, genuinely hate Amazon. And so the state senator there, the state rep there, the city councilman there, they understood that actually, if they want to keep their seat, it's not to do what the majority wants, it's to do what those people who actually show up to vote want. And they killed it. And then promptly the pandemic struck, and we could really use those jobs right now. New York City is down 454,000 jobs from the pandemic. Those Amazon jobs would be great to have. And so both parties do it. They're equally guilty of it. And I think that they're incapable of fixing it on their own. The only way to fix it is to give them different incentives.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed in that regard. And besides just keeping our fingers crossed, Bradley, how do our viewers and those who are interested reach out to you to support the mobile voting project?
Yeah, thank you. So the first thing, mobilevoting.org is our website. Anything you could possibly want to know is on there. And there's a way to reach out to us through that. You could also on Twitter, just at Bradley Tusk, just shoot me a DM and would love to get anyone who's interested engaged in the process.
Bradley, thank you for being with us. I will say that this was a quite an enlightening interview. Not particularly, it doesn't make me particularly more optimistic with regard to what we're facing, but educational and enlightening. And I loved your essentially sad example of why we still have the situation we have in this country with gun control, just as a for example. Bradley, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
This is David Nevins for City BizList, and another in our series of conversations with the Bridge Alliance. And the topic has been, how do we repair America's broken democracy? Thank you very much for joining us today.